Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Helen Toner is Director of Strategy and Foundational Research Grants at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. And before that, worked at Open Philanthropy, a major funder of initiatives on AI policy and governance. From 2021 to 2023, she served on the board of directors of OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT. So she's had a ringside seat for observing and at times influencing significant frontier AI developments. We discuss whether there is a conflict between forward-looking concerns about AI safety and immediate issues of AI ethics, what lessons she takes from the unsuccessful effort to remove Sam Altman as the CEO of OpenAI, whether AI labs can be trusted to self-regulate, and what are productive alternatives, what governments can do to address AI safety, and what the companies involved in deploying AI should do in light of all the great uncertainties about how the technologies will evolve. Here's my conversation with Helen Toner. Helen, welcome to the Road to Accountable AI.
Thanks so much.
Why should we be so concerned about AI safety? Lots of new technologies have risks and dangers.
I mean, should we be so concerned? I think the answer is probably yes. I don't think it's definitely yes. So AI is a very broad technology. It's kind of an everything technology. Economists would say a general purpose technology. So in some ways, it's hard to even talk about AI safety as one specific thing. But I think, there's different pieces of this we could tackle. One piece would be, what are we already seeing from AI that's being deployed in the world? And I think, there's clearly potential harms, potential concerns that are already being realized. For example, if governments use an AI system to determine who gets benefits or to determine how they're making criminal justice decisions, these kinds of things are already happening. And if those systems are, certainly if they're biased, but also if they just don't work very well, if they're not necessarily particularly reliable, which is often true, that's a problem that really harms people's rights. Is very, very concerning for multiple reasons. So I think we already have evidence, or, you could also look at something like self-driving cars, where, is it an AI safety issue when a self-driving car crashes? You could call it that, you could not call it that. I think either way, we can all agree we want to make sure that, we're minimizing self-driving car crashes because those are bad. I think maybe what you're gesturing at when you ask the question, though, is something a little broader, like should we be worried about the kind of more catastrophic or civilizational scale risks that some are warning about? And I think we should be worried about them. I think we should be taking them into consideration and trying to understand how likely they are, what kinds of things could reduce them, if for no other reason than that the people developing this technology are telling us that they're a real possibility, which is, a pretty unusual state to be in for those developing a new technology. Normally, those researchers or engineers are often the most optimistic about what their technology is going to do. So I think if nothing else, the fact that you have some of the kind of pioneers of AI, including of deep learning, the paradigm we're currently in, suggesting that sort of this technology they've developed could really cause massive scale harms of different kinds. Different experts have different views on this, of course. I think that alone should make us sit up and pay attention. And so then, you have that combined with what are we already seeing in terms of harms from systems that are already deployed? What kind of pace of progress are we seeing in terms of the research, meaning that we might not necessarily have tons of time to kind of wait and see and figure this out as we go. To me, that all kind of combines together as an initial high-level case for this at least being worth thinking about, worth taking seriously, which is not to say worth totally freaking out about and panicking about and throwing everything else out the window, but I think certainly taking seriously.
Isn't there potentially a tension between those two categories you described, that to the extent that we are spending time and energy addressing what are today hypothetical future harms that it takes away from the ability to address the issues that are happening right now?
Yeah, I kind of have two answers to this. I think in principle, these things don't have to be in tension at all. I think, they have very much, this sort of problems we're seeing from AI already, kind of existing harms. There's sort of a community of researchers focused on that, different community of researchers focused on more sort of anticipatory or speculative harms that we might see from much more advanced systems. And I think those two communities can make things seem like they have to be in tension much more than I think they need to be. I think there are actually plenty of priorities that that different groups with different priorities, not just those two, but many others, should be able to agree on. So things, even things as basic as the importance of technical capacity in government, us needing to have more expertise, more folks working in federal, state, other governments who understand the technology, or the need for transparency from the companies developing these systems, whether that's a company selling a sentencing algorithm to a local government, or whether it's a company developing, trying to develop artificial general intelligence. I think there should be kind of transparency requirements around for both of those companies, and likewise, accountability requirements in terms of who's responsible, who's liable if things go wrong. So in principle, I think there really doesn't need to be nearly as much tension as there has been. And I think there's been a little bit of movement towards sort of more coalition building there. And I think that's positive. At the same time, I definitely have to acknowledge that in the sort of last, I guess, year and a half, the kind of post ChatGPT moment where there's been a bunch more interest, a lot of kind of policymaker concern and motivation, I have been dismayed at the extent to which it seems difficult to have conversations about both of these types of issues. It really seems like it's maybe easier than I would have expected to get policymakers or the public really freaked out about the more cataclysmic possibilities. And then that's the only thing they want to talk about, and that sort of can dominate. And then in response to that, you can have people who are concerned about, the issues we are already seeing here and now, pushing back and trying to, get that completely out of the discussion. Let's say have that, those existential or catastrophic issues totally off the table because they're worried about them potentially dominating if they're sort of let in the door even at all. So I think in principle, they really don't have to be in tension. In practice, I understand why people see them as sometimes being in tension. And personally, I would love to see more conversations, more white papers, more policies. And I think maybe Biden's executive order from last October is a good example of this, where kind of all of these issues are present. And the fact that you are considering these really potentially scary civilizational scale issues doesn't mean that everything else is crowded out. And likewise, the fact that you want to talk about present day issues that we're already seeing doesn't mean you feel the need to kind of banish that more speculative piece. Because I really do think that we need to both be observing what we're seeing now, thinking about trends, thinking about possible futures, and trying to do that kind of all as holistically as we can.
What do you think are some of the ways that those communities can come together and find some common ground?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple. I do think that these ideas around transparency and accountability really apply across the board, and figuring out exactly what that means, exactly how you implement that, what kind of requirements are you imposing on what kind of companies, is obviously there's a lot of detail to figure out there. But I think that high level framing makes a lot of sense. So yeah, things like I think another helpful concept has been this idea of rights or safety affecting systems, which I forget where it originated, but it's certainly now been codified into sort of U.S. government, federal government guidance for how agencies use AI. Can you look at systems that are either affecting people's rights or affecting their safety, and kind of impose a higher bar on those. I think also sort of things like incident tracking. So when you have in aviation, for example, if there's a plane crash, there's this whole infrastructure set up around going to figure out what went wrong, doing investigations, sharing information between different parties. We have similar things for traffic accidents, for cybersecurity incidents, in a number of other, I think in healthcare, there's similar things. And that's another kind of thing where I think both communities interested in what we're seeing today, and also communities interested in sort of trends and future possibilities, should be pretty motivated to try and understand what are the failures we're seeing, and how can we think about preventing them going into the future. Another area would be what sometimes gets called AI evaluations, but I think more broadly, kind of measurement science for AI, which to me is trying to get the whole field on more of a firm scientific footing. A really big problem, both for systems that are causing problems today and also for concerns about more advanced systems in the future, is that right now we just really don't understand the systems that we're building. The best experts in the world can't really tell you why these AI models do what they do and why they succeed at some things and fail at other things and kind of get a little wacky in other situations. And I think one underlying reason for this is that machine learning researchers themselves will describe the field as more like alchemy than like chemistry. So meaning in chemistry, my husband is a chemist, we have really, really strong foundational understanding of the physical laws that underlie what's going on. And so for anything that we're observing in the lab, we can really try and pull apart in detail what exactly is going on there. Versus, alchemy was sort of more just like throw things in a pot, try what happens if you do it at this temperature, what happens if you do it at that temperature, what happens if you do it under the light of the full moon, kind of experiment in a lot of different ways. And much more of an empirical, try things out, see what happens kind of field. And I think machine learning researchers think of their field as well as much more of a empirical, try things out, see what happens. Sometimes it's really bizarre and no one can really tell you why, sort of a field. So to come back to the question, I think, improving that situation, giving us more of a solid understanding of what is going on inside these algorithms, what kinds of bounds can we put on where they will perform well and poorly, is the kind of thing that helps both with present issues and with the more future-facing issues.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because on the one hand, it's scary in a way that the people that are developing these technologies don't quite understand themselves how they work, and as you pointed out before, are some of the ones who are raising the alarm at some of the risks. On the other hand, there's a value, isn't there, and things that work. We don't necessarily know how, but it was not really anticipated that ChatGPT would be this great leap forward, and people are now actually using it in business without having to work out all of the mechanistic details behind the scenes. So,
yeah,
is it really important to get to some point where AI is more like chemistry?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a balance, and I don't think the answer is to say, oh, we have to, freeze everything, not use this technology at all until we understand it perfectly. That clearly wouldn't be the right way to trade off the different kind of benefits and risks that we're seeing. That's part of why I like the kind of rights and safety affecting framing, because I think it sort of helps distinguish between, for example, is my email client suggesting a way that I can send an email response. Like, there's sort of limited ways that can go wrong as long as I'm always, reading and checking it. Or is my, Spotify suggesting music for me to listen to? Like, I really think that experimentation in those kind of fields, like, why not? But I also think that it makes sense for us to look at fields or applications where that isn't actually appropriate. Or at a minimum, if we are going to use systems that we don't understand very well, to have alternatives, to have the ability to, if you're applying for a loan and you get denied by the algorithmic system, to either ask for an explanation or ask for human review, have some kind of due process, some kind of recourse available to you. So I think it is kind of definitely a balancing act of figuring out where is it okay to just go right ahead as long as it seems to work basically okay, and where is that more of a concern? And in plenty of cases, I think we can also rely on existing structures that are in place to make sure that things work well enough. So, if you think about some kind of chemical plant or an energy plant putting in new software, I believe that there are existing standards for what kinds of tests you're going to do, what kinds of confidence you're going to have about what you're putting in place there, and so. Or aviation would be another example where, by and large, airlines are not, or airplane designers are not just going in and throwing things in because they seem to work. They have really high safety standards for what actually does work. So I think in many sectors, we already have mechanisms to manage this trade-off. And it's just there are some sectors where that's not the case. For example, government use of algorithms, I think, has not been super well regulated in the past, or also some of these more general purpose systems we're seeing now, the chat GPTs of the world, where it's not really relegated to a particular sector or use case. I think we're also kind of lacking these existing institutional mechanisms to determine sort of how good, how reliable, what kind of guardrails do you need. So I think, yeah, in some cases, we're pretty well set up, and in other cases, we maybe need new mechanisms or new guardrails.
You've been working in this area for a number of years now. How would you say your own view on these questions has evolved since, say, 2021 when you joined the board of OpenAI?
Yeah, I think changed in a few different ways. One thing that's been absolutely fascinating to see has been the scale of response to ChatGPT as a product. I think something that was really, I think that was surprising to a lot of people in the field was there had been a series of advances, a series of relatively gradual advances starting maybe 2012, sort of depends on how you count. And ChatGPT was a moment where there wasn't some big technical breakthrough, but it turned out that having a system that worked well enough, that was not super straightforward to get it to be really toxic and racist and sexist the way that some other chatbots had been, and that was available for free in a very kind of user-friendly interface, that really obviously kicked off a wildfire of attention among the public, among policymakers. And I think in many ways that has been quite heartening to me and to others in the field to see that, because, I started getting interested in this field in 2013, 2014, started, being professionally focused on it around 2016. And a big part of why I was interested was because it seemed to me like it was going to matter so much, like it was potentially going to be such a huge deal for society. And so there was kind of a little bit of a feeling of being sort of lonelier in the wilderness for people in the space of like, we think this really matters. We think this is going to be a huge deal, but a lot of people aren't really paying attention to what's going on there. And so I think one thing that has shifted over the last couple of years has just been, in some ways feeling validated, but also feeling, relieved or really pleased that there is this much greater interest, lots of really, really smart people with expertise in really important other fields starting to pay attention to what is happening in AI and how does it relate to their field and, what might be concerning, what might be great opportunities. So that's been a big change in the positive direction, I think. Maybe in the more concerning direction, though how I feel about this sort of varies from day to day or week to week, is just looking at the continued pace of progress in the technology. We really are seeing, so far it continues to look like if you take this, basically the design that underlies ChatGPT, which was developed in 2017 by Google researchers, a transformer. It does seem like if you keep just sort of scaling up the amount of computational power you're using, the amount of training data that you're using to develop a system based on a transformer, that you do just keep getting more and more sophisticated outputs. And it's very contested, what exactly that looks like, whether we're on an exponential going, up and to infinity, or whether things are plateauing and it's really not going to be very interesting over the next few years. Experts really, really differ on that. But to the extent that we continue to see a pretty rapid clip of progress there, that also, is cause, I think, for some concern or some caution, given that so many of these questions about, how do we control these systems? How do we understand them? What kind of societal guardrails that we need are still very open. So to the extent that we only have, single digit years to kind of figure that out versus, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, I think that's a little more alarming. But yes, how I feel about kind of the balance of those different factors changes a lot depending on what side of the bed I got out of, what's been in the news, how things have been looking recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the other end of the time you were at OpenAI was around the unsuccessful effort to remove Sam Altman as the CEO. And so, let me just ask you generally, now that the dust has settled a little bit, what lessons do you take from that whole incident?
I mean, many lessons, personal lessons, lessons about how different people operate under pressure, lessons about how the media works, how public narratives get built out of facts on the ground. Many, many lessons. I think maybe one big important one that's especially relevant for this conversation is just that I think it, almost regardless of what you think of the board's actions, whether, regardless of who you think was in the right, I think it's very hard to come away from that situation feeling great about these companies' ability to govern themselves, and especially to govern themselves in really high pressure moments when the rubber is hitting the road and big incentives are at play. And I think that's in part because of the sort of financial incentives in question, the potential profit incentives. I think also when you're talking about people at these companies, not just OpenAI, but also companies like Google, Anthropic, Meta, that are explicitly trying to build, what they would call artificial general intelligence. We could have a whole other conversation about that term, but they're trying to build very advanced, very sophisticated AI systems. People who are kind of involved in those efforts think of those systems as incredibly powerful, or will be incredibly powerful if they're built. So there's these sort of financial profit incentives, but there's also all these incentives around power dynamics and who is in control. That I think it's very difficult for sort of voluntary self-governance structures to handle. So I think a big lesson for me, sort of reflecting on that period, and also that I hope would be a lesson that others can draw as well, is that it really does look like we're going to need some kind of outside oversight over specifically that subsection of the industry that is working on building those incredibly capable, incredibly powerful AI systems. And I think there's been some good progress over the last year or two in trying to develop some of those outside oversight structures, but they're still pretty tentative. Many of them are still relatively voluntary. So I think we need more.
Yeah. What do you think those oversight structures should look like?
I mean, I think there's been a great start I think there's a lot of reason to praise the companies involved and some of the voluntary measures that they're starting to undertake. There's been a move towards putting in place structures sometimes get called responsible scaling policies. OpenAI's is called its preparedness framework. Google has a frontier safety framework, which are basically structured around basically trying to forecast or trying to describe what types of capabilities they might observe in the systems they're developing that they would not be ready for, or that they would need to have certain guardrails in place before they could keep developing beyond that point. And so different companies look at different criteria, but it includes things like cybersecurity capabilities. Do you have a really effective, an AI system that can really effectively hack different computer systems? Or autonomous behavior. Do you have a system that can really effectively go out and sort of pursue goals autonomously, maybe preserve itself, prevent itself from being shut down, commandeer, server space or whatever it might be? Bioweapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, or other capabilities that are often brought up. And I think it's a really good step that companies are sort of setting this up in a voluntary way to say, here's the kinds of things that we're concerned we might observe. Here are the kinds of tests we're running to see if we observe them. And here's what we'll do if we do observe them and we don't have the right guardrails in place. I think over time, it would be great if those kind of structures could become a little more codified, could be a little bit less just up to the companies to kind of interpret and decide what to do, and a little bit more standardized. Maybe you need sort of external third-party certification or review of those kind of testing processes. Maybe there's a role for government. I think that's one really valuable potential step. Another category, I'm not a lawyer, so I never want to get, claim to have too detailed a view on this, but I think the category of sort of liability or accountability, responsibility would be a really great area to have more clarity on. Right now, the sort of most obvious comparison for AI systems is software. And generally, when it comes to software, my understanding, again, not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the companies developing software products that cause harm are generally not held liable. It's generally pretty hard to kind of make a case that they were at fault, unlike in many other industries where the original developers of things can be held liable. I think trying to set up a liability regime that sort of sets the incentives more effectively for these developers could be really valuable. And just to make explicit, something I like a lot about both sort of that type of approach and also the sort of responsible scaling type of approach is that it is not about setting up a really heavy-handed government regime that comes in and has to, approve a lot of things the companies are doing, and really is sort of assuming that something very dangerous is happening, that you need a really, really close government eye. Instead, I think things like responsible scaling policies or setting up good liability regimes leave a lot of room for judgment by the developers about what they're doing and what is appropriate, and a lot of room for flexibility depending on how the technology develops, which I think is really important given how much uncertainty and disagreement there is about what those developments will look like.
Yeah, let me ask you a little more about the responsible scaling policies. How is it possible to come up with a set of tests around technology that doesn't exist yet, where we don't know the capabilities, and also where, as you talked about, the financial and other incentives on these organizations are against putting into place the kinds of guardrails that we might want to see.
Yeah, so it's definitely, to me, an example of this dynamic of the sort of the rollout and the implementation of these AI systems that seem to work well, being a little bit in tension with, or definitely getting out ahead of our scientific understanding of those same systems. And so sometimes you'll see criticism from within the industry, from researchers of, well, how could you kind of put these policies into place, or how could you kind of make these plans without having much better scientific understanding of what's actually going on? And I think that's a fair criticism, but it also, it's tricky if you're trying to set the bar of, we can only put in place any kind of restrictions, any kind of guardrails once we really understand perfectly what's happening. But we can go ahead with selling these products, with getting hundreds of millions of users, with implementing them into government services, regardless of whether we have that scientific understanding, right? So I think it's about, certainly it would be better if we could do all of this based on many years of experiments, tons of empirical data, great scientific consensus among experts about what problems to test for and how to test for them. But in practice, we have this field that is moving quickly, that is rolling things out to large numbers of people in pretty consequential ways. And so I think we don't really have a choice other than to try and find ways of putting in place sort of common sense tests or common sense limits around what we might see. And I do think that there's definitely, it's more of an art to it than a science. If you look at something like Anthropic has a responsible scaling policy that goes into a reasonable amount of detail about sort of what kinds of tests, for example, they would run on the cyber capabilities of their models, the hacking capabilities. And they really kind of detail, what they would be testing for, what would count as success, how they would kind of grade those different evaluation methods. And I think that is a really valuable way to do it, that they've kind of put that out into the public, to allow other experts to go in and say, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. Because in a lot of other cases, the companies are developing those kinds of evaluation methods in-house and, determining in-house how to interpret them. So yeah, ideally we would have super well-grounded, well-validated empirical science and theoretical science to guide this. Given that the technology is charging ahead without that, I think we just sort of do the best that we can. And the more that can be happening in the open or in consultation with independent experts, so that assumptions can be checked and they can be improved as we go, the better.
And with regard to the role of government here, you suggested in your TED Talk that policymakers should focus on adaptability rather than certainty in AI regulation. What exactly does that mean, and how does that connect up with what you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it connects to a lot of what we've discussed already. I think, to me, kind of two elements. If you think of sort of our progress in AI as driving a car, I think a lot of discussions can get fixated on, should we be hitting the accelerator to kind of drive progress as fast as we can, or should we be freaking out and slamming on the brakes? I think that's a really impoverished way of thinking about our options. And so the kinds of things I think we should be focusing on, I think, are maybe more analogous to, making sure we have a really good view out of the windshield. It's not, foggy, that our headlights are on, et cetera. And making sure that we're really good at steering, basically. And so what that means for AI is a lot of things that we've already talked about. The clear view out the windshield, to me, is things like, tracking incidents in the real world so that we know how AI is causing harm. It's things like improving our measurement science for AI so that we know we have a much better sense of, okay, we can run these tests, or we can, pull apart this model, reverse engineer this model in this way and understand what's going on inside it. And the steering is, I think, about making plans for, if we do observe, if this is something we do observe, then what do we do about it? So that's sort of in the responsible scaling policy type approach of, okay, well, if we have a model that is this good at hacking, then we need to have these, cybersecurity protections in place around it. Or if we have a model that, would give, if it was stolen by an external actor, it would give them the ability to commit massive bioattacks or something like that, then we need to have kind of these sorts of protections in place around it. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we can do when I think about sort of adaptability. To me, that means both being able to tell as early as possible what trajectory are we actually on, and also then being able to respond to that evidence as it comes in.
And what about the kinds of geopolitical concerns where China in particular is often pointed to that as aggressively pushing forward on these technologies and has a lot of government involvement. And there's already restrictions being put into place in the United States. Given though that so much of the technology is open source or it's based on architectures, they're in public research. Is the genie fully out of the bottle in terms of how other actors who may be hostile to what companies and the government of the United States think are able to exploit the technology?
I don't think the genie is fully out of the bottle. I think, that maybe the genie's arm is out of the bottle, or maybe their head and part of their torso or something. But it really depends on how the technology progresses. Again, like many of these questions, it seems like right now, the best estimates I've seen make it look like kind of the open source models, if we're talking about kind of general purpose, large language models, multimodal models, and we're looking at the very most advanced versions of those, it looks like the open source is something like 1.5 to 2.5 years behind the best companies, depending on how you count and a bunch of other assumptions. And, is 1.5 to 2.5 years, is that far or is that, really close? Depends a lot, I think, on what you expect. So, if you talk to people inside companies like OpenAI or Anthropic, they'll tell you like, oh, we might have human level AI in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. In that case, a 1.5 to 2.5 year buffer is a lot. If you talk to someone who expects more that, oh, actually this paradigm that we're using, the kind of scaling transformers, large language models, just pouring more data and compute, that's kind of, we've kind of like squeezed most of the juice out of that particular lemon. Then perhaps 1.5 or 2.5 years behind is nothing. So it does depend a little bit on the trajectory. I tend to think that that's a pretty meaningful gap. But it also depends on kind of what you're trying to do with it as well. Because, in some cases, for plenty of use cases, you don't necessarily need the most advanced models. And so, a lot of my work, I work at a center at Georgetown called the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. We focus on AI and national security. And so if you're thinking about AI in a military setting, things like onboard cameras for drones and kind of automated processing that they're doing, that's not a cutting edge large language model. That's a totally different type of system. Or if you're, thinking about China's use of AI for surveillance, again, totally different type of system. So I think it really depends on sort of which specific concerns you're wanting to focus on.
And let me just throw out one other concern that people talk about, which is the concentration of power. We have a small number of these frontier labs that have access to the compute and the data and the researchers and so forth. Is there any hope of a more decentralized environment for cutting edge AI?
Yeah, again, I think it will depend on how the technology progresses. I think to the extent that we continue in this current paradigm of bigger is better, and you need more compute, and you need to be spending, the public estimates we have are that kind of the current generation of most advanced systems. So, GPT-4, Gemini 1.5, Claude, 3, 3.5. These systems cost sort of in the ballpark of $100 million to train. And that's just $100 million. Potentially a huge amount of that is just for paying for the computational power, the enormous data centers with the most cutting edge, thousands of the most cutting edge chips. That's not very accessible. That's sort of a naturally centralizing force if you have something so capital intensive. And so to the extent that, and those companies, it's as far as we can tell, in many cases are continuing to invest in scaling that up. So going from $100 million to train a single system to potentially $1 billion to those conversations about, 10 billion or more than that. So to the extent that trend continues, that is a very naturally centralizing force. At the same time, you are also seeing over time, there's a kind of a strange dynamic at the frontier of these general purpose AI systems where it is both the case, the last sort of 5 or 10 years, it is both the case that the most advanced systems at any given point of time are the largest and the most expensive to develop. And also over time, it gets cheaper and more accessible to build those advanced systems. So there's sort of a natural centralizing at the very frontier of the field and also a natural decentralizing over time if you're looking at a certain level of capability. So if you're looking for a system, for example, that is like, I don't know, what's a benchmark that is like a as good as a software engineer intern, then the first company to develop that it's going to be very expensive. It's probably going to be in a small number of hands. But over time, the number of people that have access to AI that is as good as a software development intern is going to go up a lot. So again, I think remains to be seen, depending on the trajectory of the technology, whether those centralizing dynamics I think at the moment they tend to prevail because the most advanced systems do tend to be more useful and significantly more sophisticated than less advanced systems. But if that slows down a little bit, or if something else changes, then it could be that those decentralizing dynamics of over time, the costs fall and the accessibility rises, that might end up mattering more.
Should governments try to put their thumb on the scale to promote more decentralization?
I think to some extent. I think there's interest. I think it's not necessarily the right task for governments to be trying to be competitive at that very most expensive level. But I think to the extent that governments can do things like in AI, in the US, you have the National AI Research Resource, which currently is just in pilot mode, but there's a lot of interest in kind of scaling it or establishing it more firmly. And I think similar initiatives underway elsewhere, where the idea is to provide some computing power to researchers or to civil society or to universities or to others, potentially to provide data sets in a way that makes them more accessible. I think there's people thinking hard about different models for what gets called public AI. What else might you need? Might you need expertise? Might you need training? What are the different ingredients that you can make available? I think there is definitely a role for governments to play in making that kind of broader suite of access to AI opportunities more widely available. But I would distinguish that from trying to compete with these mega tech companies, which I think is probably not the right use of resources at this point in time, especially also given that that it's not just a matter of resources, but also talent. And it's going to be very difficult to compete with industry to get the concentration of talent you need and so on. So I think not yet on that particular question.
Okay, and final thing is, let's say I'm at a Fortune 500 company that's investing and deploying AI, but not doesn't have the resources or the capabilities to develop our own foundation model. So we're using an OpenAI or Gemini or something like that. How should I be thinking about these kinds of questions about regulation and AI safety and the kinds of concerns you've been discussing?
Yeah, I think it depends on the industry and the use case. And generally, if for any given Fortune 500 company, they will tend to know their own industry and their own use case much better than I can. So I think thinking through what kinds of documentation do you need to be keeping, what kinds of potential regulatory scrutiny could you come under? Maybe right now it's not clear that your AI systems are subject to that, but if it is a rights or safety affecting use case, maybe it's worth anticipating that it could be in the future and starting to document sort of what you're doing and why. More broadly, I think if you're using a model developed by someone else, it's worth digging as much as you can to get as much information about that model, how it works, how it was tested, what data it was trained on. Different companies will give you different levels of access into that information. And I think it is very relevant and therefore worth looking at. And then certainly, a Fortune 500 company will have a sophisticated legal department, so I'm sure they'll be onto this, but looking very, very closely at the terms that are being offered, is there sort of some kind of indemnification or release of claims around, if something goes wrong, who is at fault? I've definitely heard stories of some of the providers of these models trying to contractually, push all of the liability onto the B2B customer as opposed to having it sit with the model developer. So just keeping an eye on those kinds of things and being willing to push back or to potentially consider a different provider if you're not satisfied with what you're getting. And maybe one last piece would be just to take seriously the possibility that we might see this continued progress over the next 5 years or so of continuing to have more sophisticated models. And so thinking about in your product development or in your usage of the models, what might it look like? What might it mean for your use case if the underlying model is getting more sophisticated? Is that something you can just easily roll up and make use of and squeeze more juice out of? Or is there a world where that would actually undercut your product, for example? I think there's been a really common dynamic in AI over the last 5 or 10 years has been that at any given point in time, you can maybe create sort of a specialized model to do a specialized thing, but then maybe a year or two later, it could be pretty straightforward to develop a more general model that just is better than your specialized model without trying very hard. So just being aware of those kinds of dynamics in the field, as is hopefully clear at this point in the conversation. I think there's a ton of uncertainty about whether that will continue, what it will look like, but being aware that that's a possibility and that a lot of experts do expect that sort of continued wave of progress, and thinking about how could you benefit from that as opposed to being vulnerable to that.
Good. Well, that's a perfect way to end, being on the right side of uncertainty. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. Helen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening. If you're listening to this podcast, you appreciate the value of AI governance. Wharton Executive Education is launching a new online program, Strategies for Accountable AI, featuring live interaction through our state-of-the-art virtual classroom with me and other distinguished Wharton faculty, as well as expert interviews and custom-designed asynchronous content. There are still seats to join the first cohort of business leaders in October or the second cohort in April. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.